Hello everyone and welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be diving into the differences in the suspension designs of the Giant Stance and Trance bikes, or if you're a female rider, this is the same as comparing the Liv Embolden and the Liv Intrigue. To start, let's look at what makes these designs physically different. First, looking at the stance, I will disclose that I am the proud owner of the stance, but this is an unbiased comparison and I am not associated with Giant. So Giant refers to this design as the flex point suspension. It's a linkage-driven single pivot, so it has an uninterrupted chainstay which is rigidly connected to the seat stays. Because it's a rigid connection without a pivot, the seat stays must flex slightly as the bike moves through its travel. Now looking at the Trance, the Giant Trance has Giant's more popular Maestro suspension. This is a 4-bar mechanism commonly called a twin link. From a distance, it may look the same as the stance, but it has a second linkage that interrupts the chainstays. So Giant markets the Trance as being a better stance that you should upgrade to if money allows, but the design of the stance is actually very similar to a lot of other bikes that big brands have in their lineups, including the Santa Cruz Blur, the Specialized Stump Jumper, the Canyon Lux, and probably the most similar, the Scott Spark. So what does the Trance have that the stance doesn't? Let's find out. First, we'll look at the leverage ratio, which is the ratio between the distance the rear wheel moves and the amount the shock compresses, and this tells us how progressive each design is. The first thing we notice is that the Trance has a lower average leverage ratio. This is because it has a larger shock and means that the shock can be run at lower pressures. Other than that, we see the shapes of these curves are very similar, with the Trance being just slightly more progressive. Now, when we look at the axle paths of these bikes, we see that they're rather similar, with the Trance having a little bit more rear and forward movement. It's also worth noting that both bikes have the stag point positioned just below the most rearward point of the travel. Moving to anti-rise, which tells us the effect of braking on the suspension, here we start to see some more significant differences between the bikes. So the Trance has lower anti-rise values, which indicate that, more so than the stance, braking is independent from the suspension. With the stance's higher anti-rise values, the rider is less likely to pitch forward when braking, but braking will cause the rear suspension to stiffen. Now, when we look at the effect of pedaling on the suspension, or anti-squat, we'll consider 3 values representing 3 different rear cogs, a small, medium, and large. So here we see that the stance maintains a rather flat anti-squat value through its travel, while the Trance starts higher and drops off as the bike compresses. So while the stance may look better here, it's important to remember that you're probably not going to be doing much pedaling past the 50% travel point. Finally, we'll look at chain growth, which is a measure of how the distance between the bottom bracket and the rear axle changes as the bike moves through its travel, and can give us an indication of the amount of pedal kickback. So here you see that the bikes are rather similar. The Trance does have a little bit more chain growth, but it's not enough that you would notice it. To conclude, I'll start by saying that this comparison only aims to shed some light on how these two suspension designs differ. Obviously, there are a lot of other things to consider when purchasing a bike, including cost, geometry, components, and perhaps, if the coronavirus bike shortage hasn't ended by the time you're watching this, availability. But in looking at these 5 things, my takeaway is that the stance, with its consistent pedaling performance and fewer pivots, is set up as a trail bike that is leaning towards a cross-country bike. And this isn't shocking, since half the bikes I mentioned earlier with similar suspension designs are actually cross-country bikes. On the other hand, the Trance, with that more complex Maestro suspension, enables the suspension to remain more active when braking, while only sacrificing pedaling performance in half of the travel where you probably won't be pedaling. So that wraps up our comparison of the Giant Stance and Trance. Thank you so much for watching. If you have other bikes you're interested in seeing compared, let me know in the comments below.